Welcome to Reform Thinking. Today we're doing a deep dive into something universal, something, frankly, quite sobering. The reality of death. We're not just talking biology here, the heart stopping and all that. We're looking at the theology behind it. Where did death come from? Why is it here? And, maybe most importantly, what does its universal grip on humanity tell us about God, about justice, and about our own condition?
That's right. And the sources we're looking at today, they set up a really stark contrast. On one side, you have death presented as a righteous judicial sentence, a direct consequence of sin rooted in God's law. But then there's this other view, arguing that death isn't really a punishment at all, but more of a spiritual benefit, maybe even a favor. So our mission here is to really understand these arguments, especially looking at the evidence the sources use for inherited sinfulness specifically, the fact that everyone dies, even infants.
Right, so the core question driving us is, why death? In a world God made good, why does this ultimate negative exist? What's its theological significance? Let's start at the beginning, the origin point, according to these texts. Okay, so first point from the sources, man wasn't created mortal. Death wasn't part of the original blueprint, so to speak. It came afterwards. And crucially, it came because of man's sin.
Yes, that sequence is absolutely key. Paul lays it out very clearly. Sin entered into the world, and death by sin. It's presented as a direct causal link. Sin happens, and the consequence, the penalty that follows, is death. This immediately takes it out of the realm of just, natural processes and puts it into the framework of covenant, law, and judgment.
Okay, so it's legal, not just biological. But help us understand the distinction the sources make. Why does it matter if death entered by a sentence from God as judge versus just, say, God as creator deciding life should end?
Ah, that's a vital point. If it were just God as creator, acting sovereignly, withdrawing life, well, that doesn't necessarily carry a moral judgment on the person dying. It's simply the creature returning to the creator. But the sources insist it entered by a sentence, pronounced by God as judge. This means it was ordered according to the righteousness of a judge. It's about justice, about guilt, about a penalty being assigned because the law was broken. Death becomes intrinsically linked to transgression.
So it's not just an event, it's the execution of a sentence. That's quite a heavy thought. The sources even say death entered when God was showing his great displeasure.
Exactly. And because it originates from this judicial act, the language used to describe death in Scripture, according to these sources, is consistently severe. It's called the chief calamity. It's often referred to simply as wrath. It's not just the end of life. It's a testimony to God's anger against the sinfulness of those who experience it.
There's that fascinating story the sources mention about Paul on Malta after the shipwreck. It seems to touch on this deep human intuition connecting disaster and guilt.
Yes, it's quite revealing. Paul survives this terrible shipwreck, washes ashore, and then a viper fastens onto his hand. The immediate reaction of the locals wasn't, oh, bad luck. It was, this man must be a murderer. They saw this potentially deadly event and instantly interpreted it as divine vengeance catching up with him. Vengeance suffers him not to live, they said.
So even without knowing his background, they linked this imminent threat of death to some kind of hidden guilt.
Right. And the source argues, if even the threat of a deadly calamity was instinctively seen as divine judgment, how much more should the actual calamity of death itself be understood? It points away from random chance and towards death being a manifestation of divine displeasure, a penalty reflecting a universal human transgression. And this solid establishment of death as punishment really sets the stage for the conflict we need to unpack next.
Okay, so we've got this strong view from our sources, rooted in Reformed thought, that death is a judicial sentence, a direct result of sin. But then these same sources introduce this counter idea linked to figures like this Dr. T, and his view tries to, well, soften death quite a bit, doesn't it?
It really does. It attempts to reframe affliction and even common mortality, not as punishment, but as a great benefit to humanity. The argument is that these things are designed only for our spiritual good. Think of them like chastisements from a loving father intended to correct us. Therefore, Dr. T concludes, they are not punishments in their nature. He goes so far as to suggest death itself came as a favor, a benefit, not a calamity.
A favor? That seems counterintuitive, given everything we just discussed about wrath and calamity. This reframing, it feels like it's trying to avoid the whole issue of original sin, perhaps. If death isn't punitive, you don't need universal guilt to explain it. What specific benefits does this view claim death brings?
Well, they're all focused on moral improvement. Things like restraining our desires, our lusts, mortifying pride and ambition, making us think more soberly about life, seeing the vanity of earthly things, and ultimately, supposedly, leading us towards fearing and obeying God. So in this view, death is like a necessary, if unpleasant, medicine.
Okay, I can see the appeal, but let's push back with Edwards' counterargument, as presented in the sources. If suffering and death are only for spiritual good, what does that imply about our condition before the suffering?
And that's where Edwards' logic really bites. He argues, and the sources emphasize this, that the consistent testimony of Scripture is that divine chastisements are always linked to the sin of the person being chastised. They're evidence of God's displeasure with that sin. The very necessity of using something as severe as death to achieve these supposed benefits is itself proof of our deep-seated corruption.
But couldn't someone say, well, yes, but God uses suffering to refine even believers? How does the source material differentiate loving correction from judicial punishment here?
The key difference lies in the severity and the implication of necessity. Edwards argues, if humans were basically good, truly innocent at heart, shouldn't God's blessings, life, health, prosperity be enough incentive for love and obedience? Why would a wise father need such sharp medicines, such severe and terrible means like the constant threat and reality of death, just to keep a fundamentally good child on the right path? The need for such extreme measures points backwards, he argues, to an already perverse and vile disposition. The problem isn't just preventing future sin, it's dealing with present inherent sinfulness.
So the benefit-only view seems caught. If we're innocent, death seems unjustly harsh. If death is necessary, we can't really be innocent to begin with.
That's exactly the dilemma Edwards highlights. He uses that striking analogy. It would be a strange sort of chastisement for a wise father to inflict something like, say, breaking his child's bones, if the child were perfectly innocent. And importantly, if the chastisement was purely preventative, inflicted just to stop a future fault that would seem cruel, punishing someone before they've even done wrong. Justice, in the judicial sense, requires the punishment to fit an existing crime or guilt. Seeing the universal severity of death forces the conclusion that its subjects must already be guilty.
The severity of the effect points back to the severity of the cause. Okay. So, if Dr. T sees death as this sort of gentle corrective, how does Scripture actually talk about it? What kind of language does it use? Is it the language of benefits or something else?
Well, according to the sources, the scriptural language is pretty overwhelming and points in one direction. Death is consistently described using superlatives that just don't fit the benefit idea. It's called the chief of calamities. And even more starkly, the most extreme and terrible of all natural evils in this world. Right. And we should pause on that most extreme and terrible. Why? The sources root this in our very nature as humans. We're creatures capable of foresight. We can conceive of immortality. We have this deep, innate, earnest desire after it. And because of that, we also have an extreme dread of its opposite, of annihilation. So to impose death, this ultimate finality on a creature designed with that capacity and longing, is inherently the greatest temporal suffering imaginable. An animal without that foresight wouldn't experience death with the same kind of existential terror.
It makes death the benchmark for suffering, doesn't it? We talk about deadly destruction, deadly sorrow. It's the ultimate negative comparison.
It is. And the sources point out that even the peak of Christ's own suffering is captured by the phrase that he suffered unto death. That confirms its status as the absolute apex of temporal affliction. If death were just a quiet release or a spiritual tool, that language would lose all its power, all its judicial weight.
And beyond just the natural terror it inspires, Scripture attaches specific judicial labels to it. Calamities ending in death aren't framed as helpful lessons. They're called judgments and wrath. This seems to underline that God brings them as a judge executing a sentence.
Yes, and the psalmist connects this directly to our common mortality, the fact that human life is short and ends. Psalm 90, verse 7. For we are consumed by thine anger, and by thy wrath are we troubled. He's not just talking about a specific war or plague there. He's attributing the general human condition of mortality directly to God's anger, his fury.
Wow. So the everyday reality of death is seen as an ongoing expression of divine wrath. The source material then argues that the sheer scale of it, the universal havoc which death makes of the whole human race, is the most undeniable proof of God's anger over human sinfulness.
It's an argument for magnitude, really. If smaller disasters, like a flood or a city's destruction, are seen as signs of God's displeasure, what about the one disaster that gets literally everyone, everywhere, in every generation? That universal destruction, the sources argue, must be the ultimate, most glaring manifestation of God's anger against the sinfulness of mankind. And it maintains, as the source puts it, that awful appearance, that gloomy and terrible aspect. There's nothing inherently comforting or beneficial about decay and dissolution. It looks like displeasure.
And if death really were a favor, then Christ's mission looks very odd. He came as the second Adam, specifically to undo the effects of the first Adam, which prominently includes death.
Precisely. 1 Corinthians 15 is crucial here. Christ doesn't treat death as a helpful tool or a neutral event. He treats it explicitly as an enemy. Paul states Christ must reign until he puts all enemies under his feet. And then he adds that definitive statement. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death.
Last enemy. You really can't get much further from spiritual benefit than that, can you? It positions death as the ultimate opponent of God's purposes.
Exactly. If death is the penalty for sin, then Christ's final victory involves removing that penalty entirely. The fact that the Son of God himself engages in cosmic warfare against death, aiming for its utter destruction, confirms its identity. It cannot be a good thing if it requires conquering by God himself. It has to be a curse, a consequence of guilt.
Okay, so we've landed here. Death isn't a benefit, it's a judicial penalty, the ultimate sign of divine wrath against sin. If we accept that premise, which the sources argue compellingly for, then the next step seems unavoidable. Since death reigns universally over every single human being, that must imply universal guilt. That's the link to original sin, right?
That's the logical conclusion the sources drive towards. It combines the argument about justice with the argument about scale. The assertion is that the righteous judge of all the earth simply will not inflict the greatest temporal penalty, something associated with being worthy of death, guilty of death, upon countless millions who are hypothetically worthy of no punishment at all. If death is the wage of sin, and everyone receives that wage, then everyone must somehow partake in sin from the outset.
And this leads us to what the sources present as the most potent, perhaps irrefutable piece of evidence against the benefit-only view, the death of infants. How does infant mortality fit into a picture where death is supposedly for moral correction, or is only the result of adult choices?
It really doesn't fit at all.
Yeah.
Infants are the critical test case because they are incapable of actual personal transgression. They haven't committed any sins themselves. So if death and suffering are only meant to, say, restrain lusts or mortify pride, Edwards asks, why does death fall so heavily on infants? They can't make any such improvement from it. They have no adult pride to mortify, no lusts to restrain in that sense.
And the sources point out the stark reality that statistically, more humans die in infancy than in any comparable span of life. If these infants are perfectly innocent, just objects of God's favor, then subjecting them to the most extreme and terrible of all natural evils seems not just pointless, but frankly unjust by the standards the benefit view itself seems to imply.
It becomes inexplicable under that framework. Their death must, therefore, point to some kind of sinfulness or guilt that belongs to them before they commit personal acts of sin. It has to be inherent. And to really drive this home, the sources then go through these historical instances of divine judgment where no distinction was made to spare infants. They were included under the umbrella of wrath.
Right, let's look at those. First, Sodom. Abraham pleads with God, based on God's own justice, not to slay the righteous with the wicked. The assumption is that the innocent shouldn't suffer the fate of the guilty. Yet the infants in Sodom perished along with everyone else in that display of dreadful vengeance.
And think about the implication. The sources argue if those infants were perfectly innocent, their innocence should have been a far stronger plea for their preservation than Lot's relationship with God was for his, frankly, wicked daughters, whom God went to great lengths to save. The fact that the judgment was total suggests a guilt that encompassed everyone, regardless of age or personal actions.
Then there's the flood. Again, God takes meticulous care to save Noah and his family. But the sources ask if the potentially hundreds of thousands of infants who drowned were perfectly innocent, why weren't they spared? The sheer scale of the destruction covering all but Noah's family suggests a corresponding scale of judgment covering universal guilt.
And then you get to passages that are even more explicit, where God himself commands the inclusion of infants in judgment. Thinking about the Canaanites and Amalekites, the commands were direct. Infants were not to be spared. They were to be utterly destroyed without any pity. That language, utterly destroyed without pity, makes it impossible to frame this as some kind of beneficial chastisement. It sounds purely like the execution of a severe judgment.
It really does. It resists any kind of softening interpretation.
And even in cases where God did make a distinction, specifically marking out righteous adults for preservation, infants were often still included in the general destruction. Take Ezekiel 9. God marks those who lament the city's sins. But the command to the destroying angels is chillingly specific. slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children. Infants are explicitly named as subjects of the slaughter, reinforcing that the judgment applied to them too.
And finally, the sources point to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Christ warned his followers, they escaped, but the infants of the city overall were not spared. They were caught up in that horrific event, fulfilling prophecies, as the sources note, that the destruction would involve even the suckling also.
Yes, and that destruction was presented by Christ himself as divine wrath reaching its peak, a sign to all nations. If infants were swept away in that judgment without distinction, it implies they too were subjects of that wrath. So the consistent inclusion of infants in these large-scale, undeniable acts of divine judgment is presented as the final proof. If God is just, and death is the penalty for sin, then infants must participate in sinfulness some way from the very beginning.
Their vulnerability becomes the strongest theological argument for an inherited original sin.
That's the conclusion the sources draw. Universal death, especially infant death, confirms universal guilt. #tag outro.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, the central argument we've traced through these Reformed sources is that death isn't neutral, and it certainly isn't a benefit. It's presented fundamentally as a judicial penalty for sin, the chief calamity, the clearest sign of God's wrath. And its universal reign, particularly its claim over infants who haven't committed personal sins, stands as powerful evidence for universal original guilt. This contrasts sharply with attempts to see death merely as a favor.
That's right. And understanding death this way, retaining that awful appearance, that gloomy and terrible aspect the sources speak of, is actually crucial. Seeing death as the deserved fruit of guilt is what frames the absolute necessity and also the incredible glory of Christ's work. He came to conquer this specific enemy, to pay this specific penalty.
And since, as we discussed, death is confirmed in Scripture as the last enemy that shall be destroyed by Christ, maybe here's a thought to ponder as you go about your day. What does the final, utter destruction of death itself, this ultimate temporal consequence of sin, tell us about the scope and completeness of Christ's victory? What does it imply about the restoration he brings, not just spiritually, but to the physical creation itself, potentially restoring that original state free from death? Something to think about.